I want to take you back to the beginning of the Second World War. Well, for the United States, not for China or for Australia or for Britain. That obviously came much earlier. But the beginning for the United States, well, the day after the beginning, December 8th, 1941. During the attack itself, some vessels to get underway and fight the attackers weren't part of the United States Navy. Rather, they were a part of the Coast Guard, with crews being a mix of seasoned mariners and fresh-faced recruits. When the bombs began to fall on the 7th and the thunder of Japanese aircraft shattered the morning, the Coast Guard responded instantly, alongside the Army, alongside the Navy, and alongside, of course, the Marines. It was the first sign of what would become a steadfast, multifaceted commitment to the Allied cause, a role that is often overlooked but so vital to the cause that ignoring it is criminal, because as the United States Navy plunged headfirst deep into the Pacific, the US coastline was left in the horror after Pearl Harbor, almost undefended, save for a few people known as coasties. But first, models. Yes, I know I have spruiked this once, but the competition has started now, so here goes. Do you like models? No, not that kind, that's boring. I mean the ones made from plastic. Victoria's Secret, eat your heart out because you don't have 15-inch guns and 38 hours of painful photo etch for me to glue myself on. Well, if you like models, then do I have news for you. Lord Hardthrasher, Rex's Hanger, and I are again running a competition where you get to build models, and we get to show them off, and then choose a few to reward with this mug. We ran this competition last year and we received some absolutely amazing submissions, including this tornado, this man in a chair, this smiling Bolt and Paul Defiant, which to this day is probably my favourite creation from plastic models in the world, and some others which I'll get into shortly. See, we love how creative you guys are, and with Christmas around the corner and the holiday season approaching, we want to do something with you all to celebrate. So in the description, there will be a Google Doc. In this document, you can submit a photo of an unbuilt kit to enter the competition. There are just a few rules. Rule number 1, you must start on or after the 1st of September. Please submit a photo with either a piece of paper or something to show the date of the unbuilt kit. 2, you must submit your own work. 3, strictly 1 entry per person. And 4, you can have fun, but it's kind of optional. It's model kits. You don't have to have fun. Pain is expected. Fun is optional. There are exactly 3 categories and 6 prizes up for offer. You can submit a figure, be it Warhammer, Gundam, bust, anything figure-shaped, a vehicle of some kind, tank, ship, plane, spaceship, whatever. And of course, lucky last, you can submit Spakalka, the horrors of Kit Bash, which we leave up to your minds to create. There's already some people doing things with Nobelwerfers that scare me. Last year we got everything from a Cope Lehman Roos to the horror that is Percy the Panzer. So happy building, the winners of each category get a mug, and effectively the judge's choice from each category will also get a mug too. So you don't actually have to build the best looking model skill-wise. The judge's pick exists for us to give the models that we like the most, that aren't necessarily the most skilled, some kind of reward. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to be the best model maker on the planet. I sure as hell am not. And even with my level of skill, I could very easily enter this competition. Building ends 10th of December, so make sure your finished builds have been submitted by that date. You go back in and edit the Google Doc to submit the form. And without further ado, on with the video. Before the Second World War, the Coast Guard's reputation was one of heroism, yes, but not in the face of the enemy. Well, the human enemy, that is. The Coast Guard's fame came from its actions during savage storms. These kinds of rescues have been turned into major Hollywood movies, such as The Finest Hours, depicting the rescue of the SS Pendleton in 1952, starring Chris Pine. The Coast Guard's popularity during the interwar years, though, would take a hit, thanks to their relentless pursuit of drug smugglers during Prohibition. Interestingly enough, the Coast Guard would operate 4 Stacker destroyers, surplus from the First World War, during this for intercepting Prohibition runners. But the thing is about the Coast Guard that popularity be damned and US government attempts to disband them and fold them into the Navy be damned, they would still keep a silent vigil along thousands of miles of lonely coast. They'd do it without reward, without question, and often with outdated equipment. The United States, specifically the lower 48, is, and I cannot stress this enough, big. It's huge, and its geography is a complete nightmare for naval planners. Much like Australia, which is a whole continent, this is a lot of bays and inlets. And this is really first put on display during the War of 1812, where the US Navy was able to take advantage of the fact the Royal Navy could not patrol every inlet and river with its blockade. It's a very loose blockade because it was still at war with Napoleon at the same time. Smaller American craft and their captains were able to hide in and sneak out to undertake commerce raids, and it was incredibly effective. The South used a similar tactic during the Civil War, although to less effectiveness because the Union blockade was much larger, but the Union still did struggle with its larger fleet to blockade the southern coast. So when the Second World War came around, the sheer size of the coastline made the job of stopping German submarine raiders a monumental task. As the US war machine began to wake up following the attack on Pearl Harbor though, the Coast Guard was folded into the command structure of the US Navy, with the transformation almost immediate. Members of the Coast Guard, who a few years earlier had the role of going out to answer distress calls or tend to lighthouse beacons, now found themselves piloting amphibious assault craft, patrolling for enemy submarines, and guiding merchant convoys through U-boat-infested waters. Their mission was no longer to simply save lives, but to protect the very lifelines of the war effort. Keep in mind, no North Atlantic means no D-Day. It means no Casablanca. It means no operations abroad. No supply lines means no Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. No Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, well that's curtains in many ways for many of the fronts there. It's a similar story when it comes to troops. You don't keep those supply lines open, then the Pacific can't get its troops. You don't keep those supply lines open, then troops can't get to Europe from Canada or the United States. And those troops, by all means, do make the difference. In those early years of war though, the US Navy was more than spoken for in stemming the avalanche that was Japanese expansion in the Pacific, and this left the Gulf of Mexico and the East Coast open to infiltration, particularly considering the Germans were far more ready for war than the United States was at sea. It would be here, that last line of defence, the puddle pirates or the coasties would make their stand to defend their homeland. Now, the video here really needs to split into two parts because, well, there are two key fronts. Firstly, we are going to discuss the Atlantic, and then we're going to dive into the Pacific. So without further ado, let's look at the stand of the Coast Guard in the Atlantic. Now, this video is not designed to be a deep dive into the US Coast Guard during the Second World War, rather to highlight its actions during the early war years. In the spring of 1942, the U-boat threat was at its zenith after Germany declared war on the United States in late 1941. The attacks on merchant shipping began instantaneously, with ships full of crucial oil, food, and steel being torpedoed within sight of American shores. The German Navy had prepared for the beginning of the war, launching Operation Drumbeat to coincide with the declaration by Hitler against the United States. The Coast Guard cutters, now fitted with guns and freshly painted grey, became the unsung protectors of merchantmen, and their job can be described as unmitigated boredom intermixed with moments of extreme terror. The Battle of the Atlantic and anti-submarine warfare in general, from the Allied perspective, can really be summed up in those words: boredom and incremental terror. Generally speaking, the patrolling cutters would not actually get a return on their sonar pings, searching and searching for days on end, weeks on end, in exhausting weather, in the hope that they could maybe stop a U-boat, let alone sink it. On the 9th of May, while in Torpedo Alley just off the coast of the Carolinas, near Cape Lookout en route to Key West, one of these sonar pings actually responded back with a contact. The USCGC Icarus picked up the contact just as a torpedo exploded nearby. The coasties aboard Icarus quickly moved into action, charging down the U-boat's presumed course and dropping 5 depth charges at the site of the prior torpedo explosion, waiting for the water to settle. Icarus again set off her sonar, and within a few minutes she heard another ping. Icarus bore down and about and moved to intercept, dropping 2 more depth charges. Small bubbles were seen to be rising from the surface, but with no oil slick or sign of damage, Icarus doubled back again, dropping 3 more charges. Again, the cutter turned around, and within a few minutes, U-352 surfaced not too far away. The crew of the Icarus opened fire with machine guns and prepared for a ramming maneuver to force the German crew to abandon ship, as the submarine settled in the water. With the German crew now running off the boat and streaming off and the sub slipping below the waves, Icarus made sure the job was done, sailing over to the submarine and dropping 1 last depth charge to send her straight to the bottom. Up until this point in the war, only one other U-boat had been sunk on the east coast, and it had gone down with all hands. Within 40 minutes of the sinking, the Icarus picked up 33 of the submariners, including U-352's commander, Capitan Lieutenant Helmut Rathke, and delivered them to the Charleston Naval Yard the very next day. These were the first German prisoners taken by the United States during the Second World War. The captain of the Icarus would be awarded the Navy Cross for this action, one of 6 members of the Coast Guard during the war to receive the medal. But this was just one instance, because as the war's tempo increased, the men of the Coast Guard were there to answer the call. The action of the Icarus is just one example of how during those early days the Coast Guard stood up to hold the line. But the role of the Coast Guard was not just at sea. The Coast Guard service on the home front was equally vital, with port cities and harbours across America being patrolled by coasties for saboteurs. The Coast Guard personnel protected their nation's critical infrastructure, enforced blackouts, and they established beach patrols on horseback and on foot. This kind of work is not romantic, it's boring, it's very, very dull and makes for very dull reading, but it saved countless lives. To give you an idea of how unprepared the United States was for war and how vital the Coast Guard was in this role, German sailors are quoted as describing the state of US ports in those early days as dream targets, and Operation Drumbeat itself was known as the second happy time for how many kills the German submariners were able to pick up. Just like in peacetime, the US Coast Guard took responsibility for rescuing those at sea who were victims of U-boat attacks or natural disasters. The Coast Guard would over the entire war operate a wide range of vessels, and under its command it operated 30 Edsall-class destroyer escorts, 75 patrol frigates, 8 Flower-class corvettes, 22 troop ships, 20 amphibious cargo ships, 9 attack transports, 76 landing ship tanks, 28 landing craft infantry, 18 gasoline tankers. It's the wrong word, I hate using gasoline as a word, but hey, it's a video about the Yanks, so I'll bite my tongue. 10 submarine chasers, and 40 patrol boats of a smaller kind. Coast Guardsmen also manned landing craft in key invasions such as Operation Torch, Husky, and D-Day in the Atlantic and European theatres, where a 60-cutter flotilla on D-Day known as the Matchbox Fleet rescued hundreds of Allied personnel. The service also endured significant losses, including the sinking of the USCGC Esbana, Jackson, and Bedloe, and the explosion of the USS Serpents, which killed 250 people, the deadliest incident for the Coast Guard during the war. The Coast Guard's Women Reserve, or known as the SPARS, led by Captain Dorothy H.C. Stratton, enlisted around 11,000 women in support roles too, and notable actors such as Sig Young, Richard Cromwell, Cesar Romano, they all served in the Coast Guard as well. As the years passed and the Navy began to bring to service hundreds of small escort ships known as destroyer escorts, and they joined the immense fleet of escorts being operated by the Royal Canadian and Royal Navy, the Coast Guard's role would evolve further. Men of the Coast Guard would be deployed upon these warships. Some of these warships themselves would be operated by the Coast Guard. But the big call to fame of the Coast Guard during the latter half of the European theatre was their role in operating Higgins boats and landing ships, as I mentioned, in the invasion of Normandy. It was actually a Coast Guard photographer that took this famous and iconic photo of the D-Day landings. Make no mistake though, the Coast Guard didn't just fight the Atlantic and in Europe. It had a vital role in the Pacific. During World War II, the United States Coast Guard played a vital but often underappreciated role in the Pacific theatre of war. Short on hulls after Pearl Harbor, the US Navy employed Coast Guard vessels to assist with operations such as the Guadalcanal. Additionally, the Coast Guard managed port security, convoy escort duties, and search and rescue operations across the Pacific Ocean. When the US captured an island and set up a base, it was the Coast Guard that arrived to police it. They ensured a safe and efficient movement of men and material through treacherous waters, often under threat from Japanese submarines and aircraft. Coast Guard personnel also staffed weather stations and navigation lanes on remote islands, providing critical data that supported military planning operations. It warned of hurricanes, you name it, they were there. One of the most notable Coast Guard actions of the Pacific was the heroic performance of Signalman Douglas Munro, who presumptuously received the Medal of Honor, the only Coast Guardsman to do so. Munro was a 22-year-old man who joined the Coast Guard because it was a service in which he could, as he said, save lives rather than take them. 27th of September 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller ordered 3 Marine companies to launch an assault on the western flank of Japanese positions near the Matanacar River on the island of Guadalcanal. Petty Officer Douglas Munro was assigned to lead a flotilla consisting of 2 landing craft tanks or LCTs and 8 Higgins boats, and it was his responsibility to transport the Marines to their designated landing zones and stand off in case they required assistance to re-embark. Before the landing started, the destroyer USS Monson carried out a small shore bombardment to clear the beach, and once the bombardment ended, the force amphibiouly assaulted the beach and began advancing inland towards its objective. Following protocol and his orders, Munro withdrew his boats to Lunga Point, carrying wounded Marines and sailors who went down during the initial landing, including the naval coxswain Samuel B. Roberts, who had been mortally wounded while using his craft to draw enemy fire away from the landing troops. Soon after, the Marine landing force came under intense attack from Japanese counteroffensives, and it was quickly surrounded on a little hilltop. The Marines were facing possible annihilation through encirclement. The Monson again opened fire on enemy positions with 5-inch guns, and she carved out a narrow escape route to the beach for the Marines to follow through a rolling barrage. Using a signal lamp, Puller ordered the Marines to fight their way back to the shoreline. Back at Lunga Point, orders were given to return and extract the trapped Marines. Commander Dexter asked Munro and his colleague Raymond Evans to lead the rescue effort, and Munro's immediate response was none other than hell yes. As Munro's boats neared the extraction points, they came under intense heavy fire from the Japanese forces positioned on the ridge the Marines had previously abandoned. Munro manned a .30 caliber machine gun aboard his craft, laying down suppressive fire while the other boats recovered the Marines. When the Japanese troops began to advance on the beach, Munro manoeuvred his boat even closer to the shore to act as a shield protecting the men. Although the initial extraction succeeded, one of the LCTs became stuck on a sandbar. Munro directed another LCT to assist while continuing to use his boat as cover. During the action, he was actually shot in the back of the skull, and he lost consciousness briefly. The grounded LCT was eventually freed and the withdrawal resumed. Once they reached the safeness, being out of enemy range, Munro briefly regained consciousness. According to Evans, his final words were, "Did they get off?" After receiving an affirmative nod, Munro allegedly smiled, nodded, and then closed his eyes forever. Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller himself would nominate Munro for the Medal of Honor, with Admiral Bull Halsey signing off on the nomination to send it to President Roosevelt, who gave his approval for the citation on, we think, or thereabouts, the 1st of May 1943. The exact date's a little hazy. And the medal was presented to Munro's parents on the 24th by the President at the White House. To date, Munro is the only member of the US Coast Guard to receive the Medal of Honor. Today, he is buried in Washington State as per his family wishes, and in 1954 the state of Washington placed 2 Mark 22 naval guns flanking either side of his grave in which his parents are now buried alongside him, left and right. As of today, the 8th of the 9th, 2025, or 9th of the 8th, 2025 if you are an American, the Legend-class cutter USCGC Munro, named for the Medal of Honor recipient, serves in the Northern Pacific, undertaking fisheries protection patrols and drug interdiction. A crewman from her recently sent me some patches, which I actually opened earlier today, and a challenge coins from the ship, and it inspired me to make this video. Because quite often, the US Coast Guard is completely forgotten when we talk about the Second World War. The end of the war saw a reduction in the size of the US military, and this filtered through to the Coast Guard. No longer did they need large ships designed to destroy submarines at peacetime. But, unlike the end of the First World War, that saw the US government looking to disband the service, the Coast Guard had done enough to ensure that it would remain in operation going forward into the future. In total, the Second World War cost the lives of 1,917 coasties, with countless others wounded, and the loss of multiple cutters. For their losses, the Coast Guard was able to take down a dozen German and at least 2 Japanese submarines, along with being a key linchpin in highly complex vital amphibious assaults such as at Normandy, Tarawa, and of course, as we just spoke about, Guadalcanal. The Coast Guard today is one of the most respected services in the world for what it does. It avoids a lot of the controversy that mires much of the US military, and I know there are some people who say the Coast Guard's not part of the military, but, and I'm going to quote someone in the US Navy, shut up, they're military. That is a direct quote from someone in the US Navy who I asked about this, so, take it up with him. You can go fight the destroyer he's on if you really disagree. But the US Coast Guard, like I said, avoids a lot of the controversy that mires much of the US military, and that is heavily in part due to its role in saving lives. In my experience, like I said, when it comes to talking to US military personnel, they'll happily hang insults on other services. Naval personnel will rip on the Marines, Marines will rip on the Army, and everyone will rip on the Air Force. But the Coast Guard? The general consensus is, yeah, those guys are cool. Those guys are pretty cool. This was just a brief and quick introduction to the role of the Coast Guard during the Second World War. I could genuinely be here and talk about it for hours. Different stories, different duels with submarines, the fact that they inherited a clipper ship from the Kriegsmarine. But I wanted to, with this video, bring to your attention the often forgotten actions of the Coast Guard that are so often confined to the pages of history and just forgotten about because everyone focuses on the fact the Navy was there and everyone was painted grey. Thank you all for watching. Model competition details in the pinned comment. Like, comment, subscribe,